It didn't look like a place where people died. Victims were told they were going in for a routine check, but the moment they stepped into position, everything ended in seconds. The method known as Genickschuss, or neck shooting, became one of the coldest and most calculated ways the Nazi system killed millions of people during World War II. Before World War II even started, Germany was already moving toward a system built on control and efficiency. When Adolf Hitler came into power in 1933, the Nazi regime focused on reshaping society. Anyone seen as a threat was marked. At first, executions weren't hidden, but as the system grew larger, something changed. The Nazis wanted methods that were faster, quieter, and easier to manage. By the late 1930s, German authorities were already experimenting with more efficient ways to execute people. This is where the idea of the neck shot began to take shape. It wasn't invented during the war. It evolved from earlier execution methods used by police and security forces. And once the war began in 1939, things escalated quickly. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, the Nazis had lists ready, known as Sonderfahndungsbuch Polen, which included thousands of names including teachers, professors, priests, former officers, politicians, people who had influence in Polish society. The idea was to remove the leaders first, and the rest of the population becomes easier to control. Within weeks, mass arrests began in cities like Warsaw, Krakow, and Poznan, and many of those arrested were never seen again. Right behind the front lines came the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units organized under the SS and led by officers like Reinhard Heydrich. These units were divided into groups like Einsatzgruppen A, B, C, and D, each assigned to different regions in Eastern Europe. They weren't small teams either. Each group could have hundreds of men, including SS officers, police, and local collaborators. Their job wasn't to fight soldiers, but to find civilians and kill them. In places like Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus, they rounded people up, marched them to remote areas, and shot them in large numbers. One of the most well-known examples happened later in 1941 at Babi Yar, near Kyiv, where over 33,000 Jews were killed in just 2 days. But even before that, smaller mass shootings were already happening daily across occupied territories. Victims were often forced to dig their own graves before being shot. Entire communities were wiped out in forests and fields far from cities so the killings could stay hidden. But even with how brutal these shootings were, the Nazis started running into problems. Gathering hundreds of people, transporting them, guarding them, and then shooting them all took time. Ammunition was used in large amounts. Noise could attract attention. And more importantly, the psychological effect on the shooters became a real issue. Reports from commanders showed that some men in these units were breaking down after repeated executions. Drinking increased, discipline slipped. Some even refused orders or had to be reassigned. Leaders like Heinrich Himmler became concerned, not because of the victims, but because their men were becoming unstable. Himmler himself witnessed a mass shooting near Minsk in 1941, and it reportedly shook him enough to push for methods that would distance the killers from the act. That's when the system started shifting. Instead of large outdoor massacres, the focus moved toward controlled environments. Killing needed to become organized, almost like factory work. Each step planned, each role assigned. Less chaos, less noise, less direct contact. Neck shooting, or Genickschuss, fit perfectly into this thinking. It required only one bullet per person, could be done indoors, and most importantly, it removed the need for face-to-face confrontation. By the early 1940s, the scale of killing exploded. Millions of prisoners were marked for execution, Handling such large numbers forced the Nazis to refine their methods even further. Neck shooting started being used more often in prisons, camps, and specially designed facilities where victims could be processed quickly without creating panic. As the Nazi camp network expanded across Europe, places like the Auschwitz concentration camp, the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and Buchenwald concentration camp became central to the system. These were complex facilities designed to imprison, exploit, and kill people on a massive scale. And inside them, new methods of execution were being tested and refined. One of the most disturbing developments was the creation of execution rooms that didn't look like execution rooms at all. The Nazis understood that panic slows everything down. If prisoners knew they were about to die, they would resist, scream, or try to escape. That would disrupt the process. So instead of forcing people into obvious death chambers, they created spaces that felt normal, even routine. At Sachsenhausen, this idea was taken to another level with the construction of Station Z in 1942. This area was designed as a dedicated killing facility, separate from the main camp sections. It included cremation ovens, a shooting trench, and most importantly, a specially designed neck shooting installation. Victims were told they were going through a medical check or physical examination. When prisoners entered the room, they saw what looked like medical equipment. One of the main features was a height measuring device fixed against the wall. It looked harmless, something you'd expect in a doctor's office. The prisoner was instructed to stand straight against it, facing forward, keeping still while their height was recorded. What they couldn't see was what was happening behind that wall. Hidden inside the measuring device was a small hole, perfectly aligned with the back of the prisoner's neck. On the other side stood an SS guard holding a pistol. The moment the prisoner was in position, the guard fired a single shot through the opening. Workers, often prisoners forced into this role, would drag the body away within seconds. The room was reset quickly, and the next person was brought in. Everything was timed and controlled so that people waiting outside wouldn't hear or see anything unusual. At Auschwitz, the scale of everything was larger. This wasn't just a camp. It was a complex of multiple sites, including Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II Birkenau, and Auschwitz III Monowitz. Each part had its own function, but together they formed one of the most efficient killing systems in history. In the early years, executions were often carried out using shootings. One of the most feared places inside Auschwitz I was Block 11, known among prisoners as the Death Block. This building was used for punishment, torture, and execution. Inside, prisoners were held in dark, cramped cells, sometimes without food or water. Many died there even before facing execution. Between Block 10 and Block 11 was a courtyard with a reinforced wall, later known as the Black Wall. This is where many prisoners were taken and shot, often in groups. Victims were usually Polish resistance members, hostages, or prisoners accused of breaking camp rules. They were lined up against the wall and executed by firing squad. But as the system evolved, the Nazis began using more controlled methods inside the camp as well. Neck shooting became one of those methods, especially for specific groups who were to be eliminated quickly and without drawing attention. Rooms were set up where prisoners could be brought in under false pretenses, just like in Sachsenhausen. Soviet prisoners of war were among the first large groups to be executed this way at Auschwitz. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, thousands of captured soldiers were transported to camps. The Nazis considered them dangerous and often treated them even worse than other prisoners. In late 1941, large numbers of these POWs were executed at Auschwitz using neck shots. Many were told they were being registered or undergoing medical checks. Instead, they were led into execution areas and killed within seconds. The reason this method worked the way it did comes down to something very basic about the human body. Right at the base of the skull sits the brainstem, the part that controls breathing, heartbeat, and basic life functions. A bullet fired into that exact spot doesn't just injure a person. It shuts the body down almost instantly. There's no time for pain to fully register, no time to react, and usually no sound at all. The person simply collapses. For the Nazis, this was a solution. It meant executions could happen in tight indoor spaces without chaos, without screaming, and without drawing attention from others nearby. There was also a practical side to it. One guard could carry out the execution with a single pistol shot. No need for a full firing squad, no need to manage multiple shooters or coordinate commands. Ammunition use was minimal, which mattered during wartime. The body dropped in place, and within seconds it could be removed by other prisoners assigned to the task. This is how killing started to turn into routine work. The steps were always the same. Bring the prisoner in, position them, fire, remove the body, repeat. When something follows the same pattern over and over, it stops feeling like a shocking event and starts feeling like a job. That's exactly what the Nazi system needed. Something predictable, controlled, and easy to scale across different camps and prisons. But with all of this efficiency, there was still a problem from the Nazi point of view. As the war moved deeper into Eastern Europe, the number of victims increased, so the Nazi leadership began pushing for methods that could handle mass killings on a much larger scale. The turning point came around 1941-1942, when plans for what became known as the final solution were put into action. Leaders like Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich were directly involved in organizing a system that could eliminate entire populations as quickly as possible. Neck shooting, for all its efficiency, still worked one person at a time. Even in a well-run execution room, there were limits to how fast bodies could be processed. That wasn't enough anymore. The Nazis wanted a method that could kill large groups in a single operation without needing constant manual effort. This is where the gas chambers came in. At camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka extermination camp, and Sobibor extermination camp, gas chambers were built specifically for mass extermination. Victims were told they were going for showers or disinfection. They were led into sealed rooms, and poison gas, often Zyklon B at Auschwitz, was released inside. Within minutes, hundreds of people could be killed at once. Compared to neck shooting, this was on a completely different scale. But even as gas chambers became the main method for mass killing, neck shooting didn't disappear. It still had a role, and it was an important one. Not every prisoner was sent to the gas chambers. Some were singled out for immediate execution, including resistance members, political prisoners, informants, or anyone seen as a threat to camp order. In those cases, neck shooting remained the preferred method because it was quick, controlled, and didn't require moving large groups. In many camps, both systems operated at the same time. Gas chambers handled the mass transports arriving by train, often killing thousands in a single day. Meanwhile, smaller execution rooms continued to operate quietly in the background, dealing with individuals of smaller groups. It was a two-layer system, one visible in scale, the other hidden in detail. This combination made the entire operation more flexible and more deadly. The Nazis could process large numbers quickly while still maintaining control over specific prisoners who needed to be eliminated without delay. After the war, gas chambers became the most well-known symbols of Nazi crime, and for good reason. The scale was impossible to ignore, but methods like neck shooting didn't receive the same level of attention, even though they were used repeatedly across different locations over several years. Trying to calculate how many people were killed using neck shooting during World War II is extremely difficult. The Nazis destroyed a huge amount of evidence as the war came to an end. Documents were burned, facilities were dismantled, and records were either hidden or lost. On top of that, many executions were never officially written down in the first place. They were carried out quietly without paperwork, especially in smaller camps, prisons, and occupied territories. Even with these gaps, Historians have been able to build estimates by comparing surviving records, witness testimonies, and physical evidence found at execution sites. What they've found is disturbing. The number of victims killed by neck shooting is believed to be in the hundreds of thousands, and possibly even higher when you include undocumented cases across Eastern Europe. At Sachsenhausen alone, thousands of prisoners were executed using the hidden shooting device in Station Z. These included Soviet prisoners of war, political prisoners, and others selected for elimination. At Auschwitz, especially between 1941 and 1943, many Soviet POWs and political prisoners were executed using neck shots. Some were killed in specially prepared rooms, while others were taken to execution areas under the excuse of registration or medical checks. Outside the camps, the method was also used by German security forces, including the Gestapo and SS units operating in occupied territories. In prisons across Poland, the Soviet Union, and other regions, neck shooting was used for executions that needed to be carried out quickly and quietly. The men who carried out these executions didn't all come from the same background. Some were members of the SS, the elite organization responsible for many of the Nazi regime's worst crimes. Others were regular police officers, known as order police, or soldiers who had been reassigned to security duties. Many of them had normal lives before the war. They had families, jobs, and routines that had nothing to do with killing. What changed was the system they were placed into. From the moment they entered the Nazi organizations, they were surrounded by propaganda that reshaped how they saw the world. Groups like Jews, Slavs, and political opponents were constantly described as dangerous, inferior, or even as threats to survival. Heinrich Himmler emphasized discipline, loyalty, and obedience above everything else. Orders weren't meant to be questioned. The idea was that each person had a role to play, and as long as they performed that role, the system would function properly. Responsibility became spread out across many people, making it easier for individuals to see themselves as just one small part of a larger machine. Inside execution areas, everything was organized. One guard brought the prisoner in, another positioned them correctly. The shooter fired the shot. Others handled the removal of the body and prepared the space for the next person. No one person handled the entire process from start to finish. That separation made it easier to avoid thinking about the full impact of what was happening. By the later years of the war, especially around 1943-1944, this machinery was running at full speed. Camps were operating continuously, transports were arriving regularly, and executions, both mass and targeted, were happening every day. But even systems like this don't run perfectly forever. By 1944 and early 45, the war had clearly turned against Germany, and the pressure was coming from both directions. Soviet forces were pushing in hard from the east, while American and British troops were advancing from the west. As this happened, the Nazi leadership started trying to erase as much evidence as possible. Camps were evacuated in a rush, often forcing prisoners on long death marches in freezing conditions, where thousands died from exhaustion, starvation, or were simply shot if they couldn't keep up. When Soviet troops reached Auschwitz in January 1945, what they found was a mix of silence and evidence. Around 7,000 prisoners had been left behind, many too weak to move. The buildings were still standing. Storage rooms were filled with belongings taken from victims, and scattered across the site were clear signs of what had been happening there for years. Execution areas were identified, including locations used for shooting and controlled killings, such as neck shooting. Even without complete records, the physical layout of the camp told its own story. Investigators and military teams began documenting everything almost immediately. They photographed rooms, examined structures, and collected whatever documents hadn't been destroyed. Survivors played a huge role here. They explained how people were taken away, how certain buildings were used, and how methods like Genickschuss worked in practice. At Sachsenhausen, a similar pattern appeared when it was liberated in April 1945. The hidden shooting device inside Station Z was discovered and carefully studied. After the war ended in 1945, the focus shifted from discovery to accountability. The most well-known trials began later that year in the German city of Nuremberg, often called the Nuremberg Trials, starting in November 1945. Top Nazi leaders were put on trial, including figures who'd helped design and run the entire system. They were charged with war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Some of the men responsible were sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms. But the reality is, not everyone was held accountable. Many lower-level guards, officers, and officials managed to disappear into post-war society, changing names, or simply returning to civilian life without facing trial. Today, places like Auschwitz and Sachsenhausen still stand, not as active camps, but as memorials and historical sites. People walk through these areas, seeing the buildings, the walls, and the remains of the systems that were once in place. It's one thing to read about history, but standing in those places makes it real in a different way.